So it's a warm day here in Oakland. I just listened to the Jim Rutt show, and Jim had his friend Jordan Hall on, and they were talking about the Trinity. And Jordan made a valiant effort to convert Jim to his Trinitarian religion, which for Jordan is not so much a credo as a logic, but a relational logic that requires your participation, that requires an act of faith, in other words, in order for it to become true. And so it's the sort of truth that you need to believe in before you can see. Now, belief is exactly what they were really arguing about, what was at stake. Is this a creed? Is Christ a mere belief? Or is there something not only factual in the sense of a historical event which really occurred, but also something logical, something in the way of a symbol that conveys, not just conveys, but embodies the truth. And so the Trinity becomes as ontological as it is logical. And, in philosophy, when you try to bring an ontology and logic together, what you do in that case, one way or another, is theology. And so that's the territory. It's a theological territory. Jordan's bringing his ancient symbol, Catholic symbol ultimately of the Trinity, but what the church fathers achieved with this symbol of the Trinity was a kind of a synthesis or integration of Greek philosophy, Jewish spirituality, prophetic spirituality, and gave birth to an understanding of this eternal ideal realm that the Greeks had worked out logically and mapped scientifically, and an integration of that with this moral, ethical impulse which takes shape in the Old Testament, in these stories of, Genesis. And I want to talk about how to interpret a text like Genesis literally. What do we mean by that if we do affirm a literal interpretation? Are we saying that Genesis is a scientific treatise or a journalistic enterprise of some kind? Is this, a couple of Jewish priests trying to report on something that they somehow observed? Is there a literary meaning that we can, a literary truth even, that we can decipher in this text? Or is it some other kind of genre? I want to get into that. But, the point here is that Jordan has managed to corral, I don't know what was involved in agreeing to have this conversation exactly, but I think Jordan does succeed here in at least forcing Jim, or let's just say the atheistic scientific thinker, non-reductionist in this case, Jim Rutt's fully on board with complexity and physics itself as an exemplary case of complexity, and so reductionistic explanations no longer hold any water for him. But he's still an atheist, and he thinks science is the best way we have of knowing, and religious beliefs tend to fall short in terms of scientific evidence and logic usually. But Jordan has at least brought him into this theological conversation, and he can't help responding to the theological situation that Jordan has placed him in. And of course the atheist is already sort of presupposing and even announcing themselves as such, that they are in a theological conversation. They're trying to deconvert people from theism. And that may be important. I'm probably an atheist in relationship to many of the gods that, professed atheists don't believe in. But I think, there's ways of using a word like God that I think can still carry truth and beauty and goodness, and God is not just a delusion. And so I think that Jordan's already won a really important cultural debate right now just by virtue of having this conversation with Jim, which is that we can't just dismiss God and religion, including Christianity, but really any of the wisdom traditions, the world wisdom traditions, that is, those which have found ways to become cross and even trans-cultural, ideally. And so, here we are having this conversation. We have to get theological. And Jordan lays out this argument that begins with a kind of affirmation of relation as primary. So that before you even have relata, there is relation. And out of that unfolds a self-differentiating series of relata. And Jim seemed to at least want to say that there are alternatives here, and he even claimed that Russell and Whitehead were on his side here and that they wouldn't want to make relation ultimate. And I'm not sure that's true, at least for Whitehead. Famously, Russell is wanting to defend the idea of external relationships from the British idealists, who had said really everything's internally related, and so we're all just, deluded participants in one larger whole. As, F.H. Bradley would say, there's a continuum of feeling through which each is related to all. And so Russell wants to resist that. And Whitehead does follow Russell to the extent that external relationships, this idea of the relata, the individuals having some self-creative capacity and not just being reducible to their relations, because you can have undermining, as Graham Harman would say, you can undermine by reduction to smaller parts, or you could overmine by reduction to a larger whole. And, Whitehead wants balance here, but the thing is, he's not just dismissing internal relationships. Unlike Russell, Whitehead preserves some sense of an internal relationship, and the way he does this is he thinks of time asymmetry, or process, really, as how internal and external relationships can coexist. So we're internally related to our pasts, but externally related to the futures still available to us in light of that past. And so Whitehead is a process relational philosopher. His is a process relational ontology, and he would want to think of God as, Whitehead's God is really the prime relator, not a creator God anymore. Whitehead's God is the prime relator, that through whom we each participate in a larger body. And, the ritual of communion is our way of striving together to become conscious of that fact, that we belong in this larger body, that the human is individual in each of us, but to the extent that we as individuals are human, we participate in a common body. And whether we call it Christianity or, the social sense or the confidence in one another to build together, whatever we want to call it, we're building the body of God, or Geist, as the Germans would say, the German idealists would say. And so from, a relationship with this relation, this prime relation, which Christians call the Trinity, both God as a Father, God as a Son, and God as a Spirit. And Jung would say we have to add the fourth too, We got to get the feminine in there somewhere, and she's already there in the background of this biblical story as Sophia, as Mary. And even in Jesus himself, turning the other cheek and loving his enemies. These are hardly your typical masculine heroic, just sorts of displays. There's something else going on here. And, institutionalized Christianity has a lot to atone for, and at the same time, we have to make do with what we have. And, this is the most challenging question, I think, for me, as someone who, has felt this impulse that Christians refer to as Christ, and who feels that it's probably super important for the health of our society. Even if I feel that deeply and know that in a certain sense, I still don't know how to translate it into a workable political program or, proposal for, how to reorganize society. That's always going to be a challenge. And, many churches have an infrastructure in place already to redistribute goods and services outside the context of a capitalist market. And if we're going to support people through a transition beyond the cutthroat competition of the capitalist market, where, laborers, there's two classes of people: laborers who have to sell their time, their very creative, productive capacities to somebody else, who, as a capitalist, is a totally different class of human being, who doesn't need to work, who doesn't need to sell their time to anyone else. They belong to themselves. Workers have to sell their time to others. And, there are gray areas in, like, people who work for nonprofits, like myself. I mean, there's a different type of relationship there between ownership and labor. But many people who work for private corporations have that type of, I think it's easy to say, exploitative relationship to their employer. So that's a situation that I think Christians should be very upset about. And in America, most churches are not upset about capitalism. Most white evangelical churches, at least. And it's not that capitalism's the enemy. It's not that markets are the enemy. We need markets, but we also need to reestablish the human modes of relationship that include things like education and healthcare, sports. Sports are mostly free of government right now. Science needs to be free of government control. And so there's a lot of ways in which this experience of relation as ultimate has social consequences. But getting from the realization of the primary relation to the social program that saves the world is a delicate matter, and science and engineering and technology have a role to play there, but it's also a more ancient technology, if you want, of basic human empathy and inclusion, and saying yes to the stranger, and saying yes to the refugee and to the homeless migrant people. So if America wants to become a Christian nation, that's comes with the bargain, So what else to say about this? I think, to Jim, to say that the Trinity is just an analogy is, I think, to underappreciate the importance of analogy for science, for literature that you love so much, and Lord of the Rings. I mean, Tolkien wasn't writing allegory like Lewis for his Christian Catholic faith. Tolkien was creating a world that's different from ours, and yet also similar. And this sort of virtue expressed and the theodicy expressed in Lord of the Rings does, I think, resonate profoundly with the meaning and the aesthetic and the morality of the Christian story. So Tolkien was trying to recreate the Bible for his people, for the English-speaking people, so that the deeper meaning of it could be more easily digested, right? And so going back to the question of Genesis, and Scripture generally, how do we categorize it? Is it science, journalism, literature, or is it some other genre? And I think there's always going to be a mystery here in terms of how to read Genesis. There's something there to be decoded, I would say. There's a profound meaning written in a language that can seem figurative, and that, it seems silly to me to say we believe literally in the Bible, because what is your literal interpretation of what is being said when words like tohu, bavohu are used, and the Tehom with its sort of reverberation of this Babylonian Tiamat who was murdered by and dismembered by Marduk. So some biblical historians, like Catherine Keller, process philosopher, I might add, and theologian like Catherine Keller, talks about Genesis as having a palimpsest, and below it, a layer deeper, is this Babylonian myth. And so Genesis is telling the story of the reassembly of the dismembered goddess of the Babylonian world. So, Yahweh is rebuilding this war god. Yahweh, as Marduk here, is rebuilding the world after having torn her to shreds. And there is a sense in which the biblical, say the Abrahamic traditions, have a patriarchal lean, tendency, even though there are also these feminine potentials that need to be further cultivated and allowed to develop. There's a way in which even the naming of God in Genesis as Elohim disturbs any literal interpretation, because Elohim is a plural noun, and so you're talking about some kind of committee or a hierarchy or a chorus of angelic messengers or something, not a single monotheistic creator God. So what are we supposed to do with that as monotheists, that this plural Elohim is the word chosen by these Hebrew poets, priests? The best word, pronoun would be they in this case for God. And but God is gendered severally in the Bible. This is another important thing to say here. I would really want to point Jim and Jordan, if they haven't already looked at Catherine Keller's work, influenced by Whitehead and John Cobb, and this process theology and even theopoetics. And so Genesis would be closer to literature for her, and like poetry, but the thing is, it's sacred poetry, which is to say, we don't read it just for entertainment. We read it to form ourselves. Not to inform ourselves, this isn't journalism, but to form, to become formed and reformed by it. And that's a different order of magnitude, that's a different relationship to a text. It's a more participatory one. And so Genesis is about analogy, precisely, right? And so before we can say anything about analogy, though, and its I think, cosmological importance and theological importance, we have to understand the logic, because at the end of the day, Jordan was attempting to make a logical argument in his dialogue with Jim, and I would want to here turn away from this Catholic symbol, this dogma of the Trinity, just as a matter of upaya, skillful means in this conversation with a scientific atheist, say, and instead talk about someone like Charles Saunders Peirce and his triadic logic, because when Peirce tries to provide some kind of conceptual locus from out of which a coherent logic could emerge, he says we're always going to need these three basic categories, these primal ideas. He just calls them firstness, secondness, and thirdness, but you can think of them as quality, relation, and representation. Or you could think of, firstness as our immediate feeling of a present reality. Secondness is our reflection upon that, our memory of that, our criticisms of that, our attempt to measure or decipher that. But thirdness, I've already kind of, in mentioning deciphering, brought thirdness in, which is, a synthesis of the first primal feeling with this second reflective analysis. And it's not just that these are ways that human beings engage in thinking in the attempt to know anything about anything or about everything. It's that nature itself, and even the possibility of there being a nature, is structured in this threefold way. For Peirce, that's where all logic should begin, and where physics takes its cues. Look for Trinitarian patterns in nature, and those Trinitarian patterns in nature suggest to us that there is this initial feeling or divine impulse, and then there is the physical reception of that and reflection of it. But then there's also a learning cycle that can unfold as these two relate to each other, as firstness and secondness integrate one another. They form habits, they form ideas, theories, propositional feelings in Whitehead's terms that help to guide them into a future which they begin to perceive with higher resolution, as a result of the learning and the formation which has occurred. And so in Peirce, I think we have a scientific, dialectical, phenomenologically grounded logical account, and a sort of picture of what physics and biology and psychology look like out of that logic, that ontologic. And it has a certain theological implication, which for Peirce was best characterized as evolutionary love. So this Trinitarian relationship is the guiding lure for the entirety of the cosmos and for our human society. And so it's a relationship to ideas here, and an understanding of logic that is divinely inspiring, right? And produces a certain kind of culture and produces a certain kind of society. And so that's the conversation, that we need to be having, in addition to doing all the governance transformation and the technological innovation. We also need this very ancient, spiritual technology of building the body of God together, feeding one another, on the blood and the body of the being we believe to be our Savior. And belief needs to be matched with deed, and the deed that most often follows from love, not exclusively, but most often, is sacrifice. And willing sacrifice as a loving deed is not painful. It can be quite pleasurable, actually. And so, goodness and joy do coincide in this Christic inclination that I think we're being offered right now. As we have this conversation, this curious conversation about Christianity, whether it be meta-modern or orthodox or whatever kind of post situation we find ourselves in, returning again for the first time to this Christian thing. I'm glad we're having that conversation, and let's figure out, where to go from here. Because I think, to end here, just the really important thing Jordan said right at the end about the Trinity is that even this logic through Peirce that I've tried to lay out in a cursory way and inadequately, but it can't be explained finally, because it's something you have to relate to directly, and it's more like, to the degree that we know it, it's more like the way we know someone we love. Right? You know someone you love not because you can explain them, and not because you can predict exactly. I mean, you know somebody well enough, you have expectations, and they, but they can surprise you. And if you relate to them as a person, you're not, you're trying to meet them as agents and not as machines. And that's how you have to relate to the Trinity, right? It's not just an explanation machine. It's a living context. It's as much a prescription for how we ought to live as it is a description of life. So, wanted to get those ideas into the mix. Really appreciate Jim and Jordan for sharing their conversation with us. Later, y'all.